Hello and welcome to episode 9 of Pulumi for IT Pros. Apologies about the large gap between the last video and this one. I've had a little bit of a break, but we're back now, and this week we're going to get into import. So this is how we can take existing resources that were created outside of Pulumi for whatever reason and bring them into management by Pulumi and allow you to update and manage them going forward with your Pulumi code. It's a fairly common scenario, and if you've got resources that were created before you started using Pulumi or by somebody else who's not using it, or somebody's manually gone into the portal to create these things, all the sort of reasons why you've got resources that aren't currently being managed by Pulumi, but that you would like to be able to manage them going forward without having to delete and then recreate them. It has a functionality, as do most stateful languages, to allow you to bring these existing resources into the stack or the state file and manage those, and we'll have a look at how that works in Pulumi today. Okay, so let's get started. Over in VS Code, I have created a new Pulumi project. There's nothing in it. I've removed some of the default boilerplate so that it's an empty project. To import resources, you do need a project to import them into. It doesn't have to be anything in it. It can be empty, have existing resources in it. Doesn't really matter, but you need a project where they're going to live, and obviously a stack file that they're going to end up in at the end of the day. So you need to have that ready to go. So by running the Pulumi new command, you'll get that if you want a brand new one. And that's what we've got here. And we're going to import a resource. So we've got, if we hop on over to Azure, we've got a storage account here that is sat in a resource group that we created manually via the portal. We want to import that storage account. So that's what we're going to do today. And there are two ways we can do this. So there is a command line option, which is going to be useful for where we want to import resources and then add them into our Pulumi code. And it's going to generate the Pulumi code for us to do this work. The second approach is where we've got existing Pulumi code and we want to import resources into that. Either approach will work, whichever works for you. The first option we're going to look at is a little bit better if you want to do bulk imports. It's quite useful for that, but either option will work. So let's see how the first option works and how that works for us. So we're over in the CLI and we are going to run the Pulumi import command. And there's a couple of parts to this. So this is going to paste in the command we're going to run, and then we'll just go through it. So we've got the Pulumi import command. That's fine. Then here we've got the type of resource. So this tells Pulumi what kind of resource we are going to import. Is it an Azure storage account, an AWS, EC2 instance, whatever. It needs to know what that is. Now this uses a syntax which basically has the actual type, the provider, the top level resource type, and then the actual resource. But you don't need to work this out. If you go to the Pulumi API docs for whatever resource you are interested in or going to import. So here we are looking at the storage account. And if you have a look on this, on the menu at the left, or if you scroll to the bottom, there is an import section. And this gives you an example command for how to import. And it tells you that resource type that you can just take from there. So we've got import command, we've got the type, we've got a name here, which is just the name that Pulumi is going to know the resource by. It has nothing to do with what it is in Azure. It's just what goes into the state file. And then we've got the actual resource ID, which is the Azure resource ID. Obviously, that's for Azure resources. For AWS, it's something different. You can look at the docs for that. But here, we're importing an Azure resource. This is the full resource ID for the storage account. So let's go ahead and import that. And that will basically run a preview and tell us what it's going to do. And then we'll say yes to import it. So it's telling us it's going to import the storage account. And if we go look at the details, you can see the details of the storage account it's going to import. So it's got the account name of the one we're interested in. It's got the other details and so on. And so we'll go ahead and say, yes, we want to import that. And that will run and import that into our state file. So that's done. And then what it's going to do is going to spit out some code. And so this will basically give us the code we need to copy and paste. And you see here, it tells you to copy this code and paste it into our Pulumi file. So we'll do that. We'll switch back over to VS Code. And we're going to, in fact, I'll get rid of the whole lot. Because it gives you the full code, we are going to paste that in. So you can see it's doing the imports for us. It's setting up the storage account. And it's got all the properties set for that storage account. Now, most of these I didn't actually specify when I created manually. So things like this allow blob public access and so on are all just the defaults. But Pulumi doesn't know that they were set by default. It just knows that's what the current state is. And so it's going to add these onto your resource. Same with the encryption settings and so on. But it's figured all that out for you. So you just paste that in. And then if we go back to the CLI and we run Pulumi up, what that should do is tell us there are no changes because we've just imported it. It's in exactly the same state as it was before the import, and yeah, nothing to do there. So that's now imported. We can now treat that resource as any old Pulumi resource. So we can make changes to it and it will make changes for us, and that all works as you would expect. So that's that resource imported. If you wanted to do multiple resources, you had a load of resources to import, then if you take a look at this article, I'll put a link to this document in the video notes, but you can do this in bulk, and you can basically pass it a JSON file which has a list of all the resources you want to import. Same information, so the type, the name, and then the ID. And these are AWS ones, we don't have the full resource ID, but you get the point. So you can build a JSON file with all the things you want to import and then bulk import that in one go, and that will get that all added to your state file. It will then spit out all the code you need to be able to deploy that, which you can then paste into your resources, and away you go. So that's how to do it from the command line. One other thing to mention is if you have a look at this resource at the end, you've got this Pulumi resource options with a value of protect equals true. So by default, when you import a resource, it adds this protection piece. What this means is if I try and run a Pulumi destroy, it will error. It will tell me that I cannot delete that resource because it's protected. This is to stop you accidentally deleting a resource when you import it. You don't want to be deleting existing resources, so it stops you from doing that. If in the future you decide, actually, I do want to be able to delete it, you can just run this, remove that section, and then you can run Pulumi up again, and it will set that value, and then you can run Pulumi destroy. So it's up to you whether you keep that on there or not. Okay, so now we look at the second option, which is where we can do it in the code itself. So what we've got here, I've written just quickly the code to deploy a storage account. This is the basic options needed to deploy a storage account, which is set for that one we want to import. So I've used the name, I've used the correct resource group name and the correct type. If I were to run this now, it would just try and create a new resource and it would fail because that resource already exists. So what we need to do is we need to tell it to import this one. And so this is done using that resource options box. So you remember that one we had down here that had the protect piece here. We can also have some other options in here. And so one of them is going to be called import. And for that, we just need to give it the resource ID of the storage account, just like we did with the command line option. We're just going to give that the resource ID. And that's it. And so now when we run Pulumi up, that should import it. So if we go over to the command line and we run Pulumi up, and this should go ahead and basically talk to Azure again, like we did before. If we didn't have an error, I missed a bracket somewhere. So let's see where I managed to screw that up. There's one at the end. Yeah. There we go. Okay, let's do that again. Hopefully that works this time. Everybody makes mistakes even when you do it every day. There we go. So this is going to import. So you see there, it says it's going to import it, but it gives you a warning, which would actually turn into an error if you tried to run it, saying the inputs to the import do not match the existing resource. Importing this resource will fail. We go to details, and it's showing us we've got all these properties. Now, remember, these were on the one we did from the CLI. They're not set on the resource I have at the moment. And usually if I deploy a storage account, I wouldn't set these because it would take the defaults and it would set them for me. And these values here are the defaults. But again, Pulumi doesn't know that. So all it sees is that you're trying to import a resource with properties that don't match. Either they're missing or they're different. And it won't let you do that because you can't basically do an import and a change at the same time. So what we need to do is go ahead and fix that. And there's a couple of ways we can do that to show you. So the first one is that we can obviously go in and add those values. So let's go ahead and set some of the ones it was complaining about. So it was allow shared key access. What was the other ones it was complaining about? HTTPS only. Set that to true. And the other one was TLS, I think it was, that it was complaining about. Yeah. And that was set to CLS 1.2. Okay, so those ones are nice and easy, and I can set those, and it's probably not a bad idea to set them because it explicitly calls out those values. But some of them, like the encryption piece, is just default encryption, and there's a lot of stuff going on there. And I don't really want to set that. I just want to take the default value. So another option we can do is basically tell Pulumi to ignore the differences or ignore changes. So in this resource options box at the end, we can add another property, and what we need is the one called ignore changes. And that's an array of strings, and we need to set that to the name of the property. So the first one is encryption, and then we want the other one is network rule set. Now, one thing to be aware of is the property names are the ones that set in the code, so the Python values. The one you get in the CLI was actually different. So if we look in here, you've got network rule. So that's network underscore rule underscore set. Whereas if you looked in the CLI, it was all one word with camel case, which is different. So take the value in the code. So if we come over here and add this, and that's set to ignore those. So if we go back to the command line and run Pulumi up again, this should now be all green because we've basically either set things so that they match, or we've told Pulumi to ignore them. Yeah, that looks all good. And you can see if we click on details, it's setting up all those things as expected. So let's go ahead and deploy that. And again, it shouldn't take long because it's just importing existing resource. It's not creating it. Yep, that's all good. And then the last thing we can do, if we go back to VS Code, we can get rid of some of these resource options. So firstly, once we import it, we don't actually need the import statement anymore. So that can go. We can get rid of that. Now, on the ignore changes, we can now remove this. And what will happen is when we run Pulumi up, it will see that these are no longer being ignored. And it will basically say, we're going to remove those options. Now, that's not actually what's going to happen because you can't just remove the encryption options. Microsoft will set it to the default, which is what we want, really. So if we go over to the command line, run Pulumi up again, and that's going to tell us that we've removed those ignores, and so it thinks it needs to do something about them now. And you see there, it wants to remove the encryption and the network rule set option. We're going to say yes to do that. Now I'm in sync with what I wanted in the code. I'm not ignoring anything. So I can do that after I've done the import. You just can't do it at the same time as the import. Now that hasn't actually removed it. So if we go look in the portal, go look at that storage account, and if we have a look at encryption, for example, you can see it's using Microsoft managed keys. There isn't an option to not have encryption, so it hasn't removed it. It's just that it's taken the default there. But you might find you're in a scenario where you do actually have differences. So a common one, maybe your Pulumi code applies a default set of tags to all your resources, and they're not on the one that somebody manually created that you're now importing. If you try and run that, it will tell you it can't because it wants to add tags. So what you can do is tell it to ignore the tags option, run the import, it won't get any tags, and then once it's imported, you can remove that ignore piece and you can run it again and it will add the tags for you as normal. Once the import is complete, it behaves just like any normal Pulumi resource. You don't need to worry about any more import shenanigans. That's all done. And that's it. So there's two ways of doing import with Pulumi. Importing can always be a bit of a hassle with any language because you're trying to take disorganized resources that were created by somebody else somewhere else and bring them into one place. But it's something you only have to go through once usually to get those added, or you can automate it with some of those things like that JSON import and so on. So I hope that was useful. I hope you were able to follow that and will be able to import your own resources. If you've got any questions, just drop a message in the video and I will be happy to answer them. If not, hopefully I will see you next week. Have a great rest of your day.